Thank you so much, Amina. Our other guest tonight for this conversation is Mary Robinson, who is known to many of you as a former President of Ireland, as an extraordinary High Commissioner for Human Rights, who's continued to work on issues of climate change and the environment and their links to human rights. She's now also Chair of the Elders, succeeding Kofi in that role. But I think, if I may, Mary, because I need to link you back to the earlier part of the evening, I understand you would now describe yourself as, above all else, a showbiz person, because you've now got a new podcast with an Irish comedian to bring to a wider public the issues of women and climate change. So to that great performer, Mary Robinson.
Thank you, Mark. I kind of needed that boost after all the wonderful speeches. It's very hard to follow such warmth and eloquence, but I'm very pleased to do so. Dear Nan and family members, and indeed all of us, friends of Kofi Annan, thank you for the opportunity to address you here this evening as we gather to honour the life and legacy of a truly remarkable man, Kofi Annan. I'd like to thank the UNA UK and Chatham House for honouring Kofi in a substantive way. That's the way he would have liked. The conference has started today and will continue tomorrow, and I saw so many of my friends taking part in it. I was privileged to have worked for Kofi Annan during my time at the United Nations when I served as the second High Commissioner for Human Rights. By the time I took over, Kofi had his first reform package, and in July of that year, and I took over in September, he had decided that the Office of High Commissioner for Human Rights would be part of the executive committees, the 4 executive committees on peace, humanitarian, security, economic affairs, etc. And I remember asking him, what had he in mind when he made that decision to have the Office of High Commissioner a part of each of those 4 executive committees. And he said with a broad smile, "That's for you to work out, Mary." So that was a kind of typical of the way he worked. He leaves a legacy that reached and touched millions of people, normal, everyday people, who would applaud him in the street, world leaders of all persuasions, eager to meet him and be associated with him. And most importantly, in my view, young people. Nan mentioned this and others have mentioned it, who both wanted to learn from him, but also they felt that they were being listened to by him. This gathering here in London with so many friends of Kofi and from so many walks of life is a testament to the strength of his character and his ability to connect to people no matter from what background or race or creed. Kofi led the UN, as we've heard, to some of its greatest achievements. They've been mentioned, the Millennium Development Goals. I would add the Global Compact, indeed the establishment of the Office of High Commissioner, which happened just as he was taking over as Secretary General. As a result, I was able to witness at close quarters how his determination re-established the United Nations as a body to defend the poor and vulnerable, to provide support to those suffering injustice, and to be the custodians of equality and human rights. He literally lifted the United Nations into the 21st century and gave it relevance and immediacy in a world facing new challenges of inequality, injustice, and of course, climate change. He also showed he wasn't afraid or ashamed to learn from mistakes, both individual and institutional, over the tragedies of Rwanda and Srebrenica, because Kofi was always driven by the determination to protect civilians and end impunity for war crimes and hold member states, particularly the permanent members of the Security Council, accountable for their actions and indeed inaction. None of this would have been possible without his courage, without his powers of persuasion, about what he called his stubborn optimism, for the idea that when we work together, we can achieve great things. In this current time of populism and isolationism, when polarized politics and interests have the upper hand, we dearly miss these qualities. Kofi believed in shared solutions to shared problems, He believed in standing together with those fighting for peace, justice, and human rights. And he believed in speaking out when others fell short in the face of wrongdoing. These are the instincts that endeared him to the world. They're why he made such a perfect chair for the elders, with its mission to continue the legacy of Nelson Mandela, as well, of course, as following in the footsteps of our organization's first chair, Archbishop Desmond Tutu. Like Mandela, Kofi spent his whole life believing that change is possible. As Nan said, he witnessed it in Ghana as a teenager when his home country gained independence, and he saw it time and time again in his 44-year career with the United Nations. In situations where settling for opposition was easier than seeking agreement, where intransigence trumped cooperation, where political inertia beat political will, Kofi would remain stubbornly optimistic that a way forward could be found and must be found. And he was right more times than he was not. Kofi saw our role as elders as an extension of his work on the issues closest to his heart: peace, justice, and human rights. And he was fighting for these principles right up to the end. Last July, as has been mentioned, the elders came together to Johannesburg to mark Mandela's centenary and indeed our 10th anniversary. We had a year of linking with people around the world, particularly groups that worked for Madiba's values. We called them Sparks of Hope. And by the end of the year, we had 100 sparks of hope. And I think there are some sparks of hope probably here in the audience this evening. And they are very important to the elders. We want to continue that relationship with our sparks of hope. And Amina is quite right. It was very, very cold when we marched in the street in Johannesburg. I remember Kofi had a red scarf on, which he wore quite a lot. But he was kind of tying it up to his neck because he wasn't feeling well even then, and had quite a throat. And even when we met with Cyril Ramaphosa, his voice was almost disappearing. We had to tell him to speak up because we had to hear what he was saying to the president. But it was clear that he was already struggling a bit at that stage. And we, of course, particularly met young people in South Africa. And as Nan has emphasized, Kofi always thrived when meeting young people, listening to them, respecting them, and encouraging them in their endeavors and ambitions. He would have been delighted to have seen so many young people. I saw them as we came in the audience here this evening. And as you've heard, and I want to repeat this because he said it so often, he said it several times in Zimbabwe, you are never too young to lead, and we are never too old to learn. And that phrase has become something of a soundbite for the elders as we continue this crucial intergenerational dialogue. It's a phrase that also feels incredibly pertinent as we watch with admiration the young people and school children taking the lead in the battle against climate change. I mean, as somebody who's very much tried to not talk so much about climate change as climate justice, it's wonderful to see how the children and young people have brought home a mainstreaming of the justice, the injustice of intergenerational injustice. The very fact that it now affects every family in the world, and that somehow we have to have regard for our children and grandchildren and those who will follow. And Kofi saw climate change as the threat to all humanity. He understood the injustice of it and how, without action, it will rob future generations of the rights and opportunities many of the current generation had taken for granted. And I think if his legacy stands for anything, it should be the strength not to accept such an injustice. Directly after marking Madiba's centenary, where we also completed that symbolic walk together, Kofi, Dr. Brahimi, and I, not Grasa, Dr. and myself, three of us, undertook an elders' mission to Zimbabwe just before the country's elections at the end of July. And it was a difficult and demanding mission. We had so many meetings. Kofi was not feeling well. He hadn't felt well on the plane going to Harare. He just kept going. He just pushed himself. He just worked his heart out because he felt we might be able to help the people of Zimbabwe, and that's what he wanted to do. His passion, his determination, even his optimism were as strong as ever. And I know that Kofi would often quote an Irish poet that I'm also very fond of, William Butler Yeats. But he used to quote a dark passage from Yeats from time to time, the lines from The Second Coming, that the best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. But I actually believe that Kofi's life is a rebuke to the great Irish poet. He was driven by passionate intensity of the very best convictions that peace, justice, and human rights are not only to be desired, but essential values that must be fought for. His was a courageous, inspirational, warm, and humane life, and he leaves a legacy that will echo down through the generations. And I'm so proud that we're marking it here in London in such a wonderful way. Thank you. Yes.